Welcome to day 22 of the macOS and iOS security internals advent calendar. Today we were looking at various Mach port hardening strategies that Apple implemented. So to understand why Mach port hardening strategies are required, we first have to understand that there's like a number of common attacks in the wild that are used against Mach ports. This is first and foremost the port-oriented programming, something that has basically powered a lot of public jailbreaks and also private exploits. Then we have the whole problem of task and thread port abuse. Here we are talking about legal usage of that. Then we have the whole issue of exporting the kernel task port to userland. And last but not least, we have a whole class of attacks that involve the theft of Mach ports across task boundaries. So let's have a look at each of these. First of all, port-oriented program. What is that? It is basically a technique that involves the creation of fake ports within kernel memory. Then what we usually do is we have to redirect a valid port pointer to this fake created port, and then we cleverly abuse available API on that specific type of object to gain some leverage. A very common attack, for example, was to have a fake task port that points to a fake proc structure, and this allowed us with the use of pit for task to actually read arbitrary 32 bits inside kernel memory. And so basically port-oriented programming is the art of finding ports that we can fake, finding API that we can abuse through these faked ports, and then combining this to basically have full memory control over the target. So what defenses are there? What defenses did Apple implement to fight this? The first defense we already saw in the Mach Ports chapter, because Apple started to go into the port structure and protect all the pointers, or let's say all the important pointers with data pack. So that means it is basically impossible without a pack signing gadget or something like this. It is basically impossible to create an arbitrary fake port in memory now. That's simply because of the usage of pack now on all these pointers. One thing is important here, this IPK object is something that is manually packed because I guess in some cases Apple does not apply a pack because it's not a pointer in sometimes what's stored in this object. But it's also packed normally for the normal use case of pointing to a kernel object. So the next thing that Apple did is they used the power of the zone allocator, namely the new zone require function, to basically ensure that whenever they attach a port, it is really a port. And I mentioned it before, Apple has not only zone require, they also have zone require ID. And the idea is that each important kernel object has a numerical ID that is fixed. For example, here we have the zone ID IPC port and zone ID IPC port set. So depending if an IPC object is just a port or a port set, this function here, the IPC object validate, will actually check if the submitted pointer is of the right zone type. Because if this is not allocated in the right zone, then it is for sure an attack and a malicious port here. And the thing is, by putting this into this function is basically used by something like IPC object log, which is also alias as IO log. These functions are used everywhere so that most code paths now that somehow use ports in this way, they will automatically be protected, because they will sooner or later always try to lock this thing, and so they will always be automatically protected against this kind of attack. So let's go to the next kind of common attack. This is the task and thread port abuse. So the thing is, having access to a task or thread port is extremely dangerous because they automatically allow read-write access to the task's memory via things like VM read and VM write. But it also allows you access to the thread state. If you have a task port, for example, you can ask for the threads, and when you have a thread port, you directly have it. And then you have access to stuff like thread set state and thread get state, which allows you access to the thread state, which is basically the CPU registers. So you basically have control over the code execution. But not only that, basically the moment you have these ports, you can call any kind of API that involves a thread or a task, and so that's very powerful, and this could be a lot of different use cases for attackers, basically. So that's usually a bad thing to have access to this. So in order to understand the protections, you have to know that in macOS and iOS and XGNU, when you have something like Mach API, they always try to convert a port to a specific data type. So there's a function convert port to task, there's a function convert port to map. And this is what you normally use for reading and writing memory. So inside these functions, they will now call a function that's called task conversion eval internal. So this function is a little bit longer, but one part here in the code that you can see here, which is obviously disabled for macOS, is that if a binary is marked as platform binary, then it can only ever be touched if the caller is also a platform binary. So this here is basically a protection against a non-platform binary abusing a task port of another platform binary. So this would be, for example, an attack where you have an app on an iOS device, and the app somehow can trick, for example, LaunchD, because that happened in the past. They can trick LaunchD to give them a task port for some daemon. Then suddenly they have an access to this task port for the daemon. But this code here on iOS would stop this from being able to convert, so it will automatically return a security error here, and then it would be, the caller would get a null, and that's basically the API would not work. So that's the first level of protection that apparently is only active on iOS. The next level of protection that Apple invented is basically that they looked through all the API that uses task and thread ports, and they realized not all of the APIs necessarily need a full privileged task port or a full privileged thread port. And so what they did is they basically created flavors of these task and thread ports. Depending on what flavor a task or thread port is, it can be used with different Mach API, and so lower privileged Mach API does not need a task control port. So that means there can be relaxed security on this compared to like a task control port that would give you access to the whole task memory, read and write and stuff like that. So the flavors they invented are basically control, inspect, read, and in case of task ports they also have a name. So they did this internally by creating new types of kernel objects, new defines for iCod. Basically the IPC kernel object type, and we have there basically an iCod task control, iCod task inspect, iCod task read, iCod task name, and then iCod thread control, iCod inspect, thread inspect, iCod thread read. There's no iCod thread name. And the idea is now that depending on the API, you need to have access to one of those kind of kernel objects. And of course, a higher object could be downgraded to a lower one, but the lower one could not be upgraded to a higher one. And so you can ensure that if someone has a task inspect port, they cannot actually use an API that requires a task control port. And in order to do this, they basically went manually through all the API and decided which of those functions should be assigned what kind of flavor, and then so a full overview over what is available via what port flavor would be you have to look in the source code and look at specifically at the .dev files and see where they use the specific for example task underscore inspect underscore T and stuff like that, so you would know which API uses what kind of flavor now. So one specific case of task ports that have been abused many times in exploits are the so-called kernel task ports. What this basically is, it's just a task port, but this time the kernel object it points to is actually the kernel task structure. And obviously when you have access to that, ignoring all the other protections, what would happen is that you have read-write access to kernel memory, and among other things, of course. And this is something that could be abused for a kernel memory read-write gadget. This is actually something a lot of jailbreaks or exploit did. They basically created fake ports that then would be kernel task ports, and then they used them. And depending on what version of macOS and so on you're on, you could even legally ask the system for this kind of port and use it because some API was not protected. So the thing here is now the other use case is also that jailbreaks often made this kind of port available to the researcher, because then the researcher has an easy read-write access to kernel land by just using this port that he can ask for. So anyway, Apple didn't like that, so they started building up defenses. And of course, the previous defenses already are some kind of defenses against this, but they go further here. So one thing that they did is they built a new protection into the same task conversion eval or a task conversion eval internal function. So basically what you see here is that when there's a secure kernel, then you can never transport out the kernel the kernel task port. If you are not on a secure kernel, then you can theoretically, but you can actually only get access to the kernel if you are the kernel itself, basically. So there's a little bit of code stripped from here, but basically the idea is you can only reach this here if you are the kernel yourself, and and only if it's allowed, then it can be returned to the user. Otherwise, it would never be able to leave this here, basically. Yeah, so that's the first thing. The side effect of this is that basically every legal API that tries to give you a kernel task port would also fail, because, well, they can give it to you, but you cannot make use of it because of this code here. Yeah, so the next defense, there is actually one missing from the slide decks.
In the same function here, there's also a task require in there. So there's also a check that the pointer that we get here, the victim, is actually a real allocated task. It could be fake memory, but this is also checked nowadays, but it's not on the slides. But the next protection that they added is actually goes a little bit deeper, because it would theoretically be possible to have an arbitrary task that is a real task that points to an arbitrary real map, and then inside this map we have a pointer faked because we override the pmap pointer with the kernel pmap pointer. In this case we would bypass all the other checks, but this new check here in convert port to map with flavor will see this. So this code will see, oh wait a second, we have a pmap here, and that is actually the kernel pmap. So any task does not is not allowed to share the pmap with the kernel pmap. So yeah, so the pmap, basically the page mappings. So the protection here is it's not allowed to be the kernel pmap, but it's also protected with a pmap require, which again is a check if this allocation actually comes from the pmap zone. So this cannot be an arbitrary pointer somewhere in memory. This needs to be actually inside the pmap zone. So nowadays, if you would want to fake a kernel task, you would have to take a valid pmap here and copy the content of the kernel pmap into it. Then maybe you can trick it unless you run into another protection that might be hidden somewhere else or is in a newer version or so. Okay, so that's what we saw so far. We are basically protected in regards to task ports and also in specific for kernel task ports. Now let's go to the last kind of attack, the so-called port theft attacks. And it's a very common attack. Basically, the idea is that you steal a port from another process that is more privileged than you. This stems from the idea that in the past, all port access checks were always on exporting the port to userland. There was never a runtime check. So a lot of exploits basically focused on stealing the port from someone else who already has it, because afterward they wouldn't face any more security checks. And yeah, so how would you steal a port? Well, there might be a lot of different ways to steal a port by overwriting or corrupting kernel memory. But the usual way this would work in user space only is that the target would send a Mach message to you, or an XPC message, which in the end is basically a Mach message. And by corrupting the content of the Mach message or the content of the XPC message, we can actually embed a fake port descriptor into the Mach message, the underlying Mach message. And then the next thing we would need to do is we need to guess a port name for a port that is interesting to us. Like, for example, an IOKit connect port would be very interesting because maybe our target can open a driver connection that we cannot. And if we could steal it from him, then we would be able to actually control a driver and call functions on the driver. This is something that has happened in the past, even public exploits. Well, maybe not public normal exploits, but Zero Day used in the wild used this kind of attack. They stole an IOKit Connect port, and so this is when Apple likely decided to do something against this. And so what they came up with is a new type of protection. It is basically the so-called immovable send and receive rights. They basically added a number of checks in various places, but the most important ones are in a function called ipc_write_copy_in. So this is the function that will be used to basically take a port that is referenced from userland and make it available to kernel land. And the problem here is that if there's a protection here, like an immovable send write, then you can never actually attempt to move the send write from one process to the other, from one task to the other, because this function here would detect this. Like here you can see this in the case of a move send write, it would realize, oh wait a second, this port is actually immovable for send. And when this happened is on the copy in, it will actually call a Mach port guard exception. So that basically the process dies more or less, and you cannot steal the port from it. And for receive writes, there's the same kind of protection, and for send writes, this protection is, for example, automatically applied to all task control, thread control, and IOKit connect ports. So all the juicy targets that were usually targeted by exploits, the task ports, the thread ports, and the IOKit connect ports, when you now try to steal them from another process, this will actually end up in a guard exception, and so it will not work. It will just die. So when you look at the newest macOS Ventura or iOS 16, you will see that Apple has added more automatic protections now. For example, they now have the concept of a MPO service port. So basically, when you call Mach port construct, you can tell the system that this is a service port. This is something that normally a launchd would use. It would declare this is a service port for a launch daemon. Then they have automatically also their send writes protected, so you cannot steal this from, in this case, launchd. There's also the idea that you have a connection port. Then you have automatically protection for send and receive writes. And you can see this here is the snippet from Mach port construct, where basically in the case of these protections, it will protect the receive write here. Oh wait, this is actually wrong on the slide. So this should be receive, and send and receive for the connection port. Yeah, so obviously this here should be receive and not send, as you can see here. Good that the code snippet was there, otherwise I wouldn't have noticed the error so easily. Yeah, so that's it. These are the protections that are most obvious when it comes to Mach ports and how they're protected now. This doesn't mean that there are not other mitigations around. Apple always adds more and more mitigations, and sometimes they're just very small and you don't really necessarily see them, or you forget about them until you actually run into them. So yeah, so this is the most important mitigations regarding ports. This is it for today. Let's meet together tomorrow for day 23 of the advent calendar, which is like the second to last. And yeah, have a great evening and see you tomorrow.